Hello everyone. In this video, I'll be showing you how to sew the early TNG style yokes. These early yokes were primarily seen on the jumpsuits and skants, as well as Dr. Pulaski's medical smocks in Season 2. Sewing patterns for these uniforms are available on my Tailors Gone Wild website, www.tailorsgonewild.com. I'll be demonstrating with my TNG jumpsuit sewing pattern, so keep in mind that the pattern pieces I mentioned by name are different for the other uniform patterns. The process is basically the same though. So let's dive in. The early TNG jumpsuit's front yoke assembly is comprised of three pieces: the upper front yoke, the lower front yoke, and a division-colored strip of fabric for the yoke trim. On the original uniforms, the trim was a different, lighter-weight spandex than that on the rest of the jumpsuit body, and the two fabrics were often slightly different colors. However, for replica purposes, I suggest just using the same division-colored jumbo spandex for both the jumpsuit body and trim. I've done this for nearly all of my jumpsuit replicas, and they've turned out fine. I also suggest applying a lightweight fusible interfacing to the centermost 2.5 inches or so of the front yoke pieces. This will help prevent the spandex pieces from stretching out of shape as we go. You can also interface more of the upper right front yoke to help support the rank bars if you like. There's a pattern piece for the front yoke trim, piece R, but it's just a strip of bias cut fabric exactly 1 1/8 inches wide. Press your trim fabric in half, lengthwise. If you're using the same jumbo spandex as the jumpsuit body, I suggest folding the matte or dull sides together so the trim is shiny sides out. Baste or sew the length of trim closed along the seam line, 3/8 of an inch from the raw edges. I recommend using a quilting/even feed walking foot for this to help prevent the bias strip from stretching as you go. Cut the length of trim in half. Each half will be for one side of the yoke. Pin the front yoke trim to the lower front yoke, piece B2, with the folded side down and the upper edges flush. There will probably be some excess, but that's fine. Better too much than not enough. Sew the trim to the lower front yoke along the seam line, 3/8 of an inch from the upper edges. Trim away the excess on the ends. Pin the upper front yoke, piece B1, to the lower yoke assembly, right sides together, then sew the yokes together, stitching exactly over the previous stitch line, 3/8 of an inch from the edge, with the yoke trim sandwiched between them. Press the seam allowances and upper yoke upward. There should be exactly 3/16 of an inch of trim fabric extending outward from underneath the seam. I suggest trimming the yoke trim allowance down to 1/8 of an inch to reduce bulk inside the seam, especially if you're using jumbo spandex. I also strongly suggest trimming away the yoke seam allowances along the frontmost few inches to reduce bulk. Repeat for the other side and check to make sure both yokes are exactly the same size at the center front. For the jumpsuits and medical smocks, sew the yoke to the body and press the seam allowances open. For the skants, the yoke is attached a bit differently because of the horizontal invisible zipper. See the sewing tutorial on my Star Trek Costume Guide blog for that one. The early back yoke is basically made the same way as the front yokes were. You'll need the upper back yoke, piece C1, the back yoke trim, again piece R, and the lower back yoke, piece C2. Press and baste your back yoke trim the same way we did earlier for the front yokes. Pin the back yoke trim to the lower back yoke, piece C2, folded side down, with the upper edges flush. There'll probably be some excess, but that's fine. Better too much than not enough. Sew the trim to the lower back yoke along the seam line, 3/8 of an inch from the upper edges. Trim away the excess at the outer edges. Pin the upper back yoke, piece C1, to the lower yoke assembly, right sides together, then sew the yokes together, stitching exactly over the previous stitch line, 3/8 of an inch from the edge, with the yoke trims sandwiched between them. Press the seam allowances and upper yoke upward. There should be exactly 3/16 of an inch of trim fabric extending outward from underneath the seam. I suggest trimming the yoke trim allowance down to 1/8 of an inch to reduce bulk inside the seam, especially if you're using jumbo spandex. Skipping around a bit, depending on which uniform you're making, pin the right front assembly to the back assembly along the shoulders and outer sleeve, right sides together, matching yoke trims and outer yoke corners at the seam line. Baste over these areas and check to make sure they properly align. Adjust as needed if they don't. Then sew the assemblies together along the entirety of the seam with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Press the seam allowances open. I suggest notching the outer shoulder allowances along the curve to help them stay open. I also suggest tacking the allowances open by hand along the lower outer yoke area, taking care to only stitch through the allowances and not onto the outside of the jumpsuit. Repeat for the other side of the jumpsuit. Again, skipping around a bit, depending on which uniform you're making, we need to attach the neckline trim. There's a pattern piece for the neckline trim, again piece R, but it's again just a strip of bias cut fabric exactly 1 1/8 inches wide. As you might remember from my costume analysis, the neckline trim was done differently in seasons 1 and 2. For the season 1 neckline trim, press and baste the strip of trim fabric the same way we did for the yokes. Pin the neckline trim to the outside of the jumpsuit neckline so its raw edges are flush with the edge of the neckline. There will probably be some excess, but that's fine. Better too much than not enough. Sew the trim to the neckline with 3/8 inch seam allowance, stitching exactly over the previous stitch line. Trim away the excess on the ends. Press the allowances under and press the trim outward toward the neckline. Trim the allowances down to about 1/8 of an inch along the centermost few inches to reduce bulk. I also suggest trimming the second, middle layer of trim fabric down to 1/8 of an inch around the entire neckline, especially if you're using the same jumbo spandex as the rest of the jumpsuit. Trim away the excess from the front edges. Using black thread, catch stitch the trim allowance to the underside of the yoke, taking care to only stitch through a single thread of the yoke fabric each time, so your stitches won't be visible on the outside of the finished jumpsuit. The Season 2 neckline had a similar look, but instead of the trim extending outward from underneath the neckline, the edge of the neckline was actually bound with the neckline trim. So for the Season 2 technique, trim away 3/16 of an inch from both the jumpsuit neckline and the trim strip. Pin your neckline trim to the jumpsuit neckline, edges flush. Sew your neckline trim to the yoke 3/16 of an inch from the edge. Wrap the trim snugly around the edge and pin the underside of the trim into place. Again using black thread, stitch in the ditch along the lower edge of the neckline trim. Catch stitch the seam allowances to the underside of the yoke, just like with the Season 1 method. Or you can simply cut away the excess neckline trim close to the stitch line, like on this screen-used jumpsuit. There are free sewing tutorials for all the uniforms I mentioned on my blog, www.StarTrekCostumeGuide.com. Like I mentioned earlier, sewing patterns for them are available at www.taylorsgonewild.com, both as physical copies and digital downloads. I've also put together an entire video walkthrough on how to make the TNG jumpsuits, which you can also get on the Taylor's Gone Wild website. I don't know about you, but I'm a monkey see, monkey do kind of learner. The free tutorial on my blog is very thorough, with detailed instructions and dozens of photos, but I definitely learn best when somebody says, sew these two pieces together along this seam, and I get to actually watch them do it, so I know exactly how to do it too. The full walkthrough is over an hour and a half long, and we cover literally every step of the entire process. Sew this, press these seams, line this thing up with this thing, and before you know it, you have a finished uniform. So check that out if you're interested, and I'll catch you in the next video.